Thanks very much, Robert, and thanks to all of the conference organisers. It's great to be here, and thanks for the opportunity of presenting. So my presentation will focus on supported decision-making, which I think is a positive approach to promoting rights and preventing coercion. So one of the approaches Piers was talking about. As Robert mentioned, I'm a professor of social care at Queen's University in Belfast. So just to give you a sense of what's ahead, in terms of my presentation, I'll focus initially on definitions of supported decision-making, and look at some perspectives on why it's important to consider developing it. I'll mention the new legal framework in Northern Ireland, where we're trying to replace mental health law with a mental capacity-based legal framework. Then look at the range of types of supports that are needed. Some sources of guidance, including the World Health Organization guidance, as Piers mentioned, and then a few thoughts about how supported decision-making might develop in the future. The overall theme of my presentation is a basic one, really. It's that by focusing more on supporting people to make their own decisions, we will better promote their rights and reduce the need for coercion. Okay. So the rationale, the need for supported decision-making is that people's ability to make decisions may be impaired for a wide range of reasons, including because of their mental health problems. But with support, some people who would otherwise have been unable to make the relevant decisions can make their own decisions. And so it's an important way to try and prevent infringements or restrictions on people's rights. Supported decision-making, therefore, simply refers to that process of support and decision-making. It has specific origins in the disability rights movements in Canada and Australia. Piers, as we've just been listening to, suggested that it can be useful when you're thinking about supported decision-making to distinguish between more formal approaches which involve a legal process and more informal processes which we all use. He also helpfully clarifies that shared decision-making is a related concept. Arguably, it's a form of supported decision-making, but it focuses much more specifically on involvement in healthcare decisions. Okay. So thinking then about why it's important to consider these approaches, the wider context is maybe the ongoing debate about when it is necessary and proportionate for the state or indeed another person to make a decision about someone else's life. There's a long history of considering the importance of equal rights and autonomy. For example, Marcus Aurelius, in one of his meditations, advocated for the idea of a polity in which there is the same law for all, which respects most of all the freedom of the governed. John Locke, in the second treatise on government, suggested freedom under government is to have a standing rule to live by, common to everyone of that society, and not to be subject to the inconstant, uncertain, unknown, arbitrary will of another. So beautiful language, really. John Stuart Mill then, on liberty, argued that the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against their will is to prevent harm to others. Though he did include the caveat that those who are still in a state to require being taken care of by others do need to be protected against their own actions as well as external injury. So there are a range of arguments to support decision-making. Some are more rights-based and some are more pragmatic or effectiveness-based. So we'll focus initially on some of the rights-based arguments. These are clearly established in the European Convention on Human Rights in Article 5, which states everyone has the right to liberty and security of person. It does allow, obviously, for some situations when people can be deprived of their liberty, but then requires safeguards to ensure that that is really as minimised In terms of Article 12 of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, it requires states to take appropriate measures to provide access by persons with disabilities to the support they may require in exercising their legal capacity, and to ensure that the measures in place for when a person, even with support, is unable to make a decision, those measures respect the rights, will and preferences of the person, are proportional and tailored, apply for the shortest time possible, and are subject to review. So these frameworks have implications for our current legal frameworks. As Professor Helen Herman mentioned, there's ongoing debate really about what Article 12 should mean in practice. I think an important note is that the concept of legal capacity is much broader than support decision-making. It applies in circumstances, our right to legal capacity applies in circumstances even when we're unable to make the relevant decision. Just to mention a little bit about the Northern Ireland context where we've been trying to respond to some of these debates. It's a small country, superimposed Lithuania on the island of Ireland there, so it's good to be in a sort of comparable size of country. It's unusual for me. Northern Ireland is it may be appropriately the sort of grey counties in the north of the whole of the island of Ireland. Ireland was partitioned by the Government of Ireland Act in 1920, and so Northern Ireland was established in 1921, so we've just had our first centenary. It'll be interesting to see. I think it seems unlikely now that we'll have another. It maybe depends on what happens in Scotland. If you're aware of Northern Ireland, it's probably because of the political conflict there, which really was from about 1969 to what's referred to as the Good Friday Agreement in 1998. So the paramilitary organisations are still part of our society. That's a mural from Belfast which suggests that, but yeah, it probably has meant that we're very focused on human rights and the need to protect them. So in thinking about the legal framework which might be necessary for providing a process for decisions to be made when a person is unable to make them, the usual process is to review the current legal framework, identify relevant developments in case law, explore similar laws and updates in other jurisdictions, and then consider how the current laws could be further developed. That process may neglect, though, more fundamental questions about whether the current laws are the best available approach. So the concern in the discussions in Northern Ireland was that having a separate mental health law with different criteria for compulsory intervention than other legal frameworks for decision-making is discriminatory. And so just revising current mental health law may help promote rights, but will not address that basic inequity. The idea that even if you are able to make the relevant decision, intervention may still be forced under mental health law. This was informed by the work of George Smukler, who's at the conference, and John Dawson, who's a constitutional lawyer in New Zealand, who proposed a non-discriminatory alternative, which is the fusion approach. The idea is to have a capacity-based legal framework for everyone, rather than to have a separate mental health law. The timing of George's work was ideal. That article is a really clear, beautiful articulation of the arguments, and it was published just at the time when we were reviewing the legal framework in Northern Ireland. Arguably, I mean, as Helen mentioned, this is subject to ongoing debate, but arguably this would be a positive response to the UNCRPD's Article 12 requirement of equal recognition before the law. So in Northern Ireland in 2007, the review process concluded that having one law for decisions about physical illness and another for mental illness is anomalous, confusing and unjust. And so eventually, it was a long and inclusive, which is a great process, but a long process. The Mental Capacity Act Northern Ireland 2016 was passed, which aims to provide one comprehensive framework for all, and so no longer have a separate mental health law. So the central criterion under the Capacity Act is whether the person is able to make the relevant decision at that time, rather than the traditional mental health law criteria of mental disorder and risk. Within the Act, there's a statutory duty to provide support, which is stated in Section 1.4, which is that the person is not to be treated as unable to make a decision for himself or herself about the matter, unless all practicable help and support to enable the person to make a decision about the matter have been given without success. What's meant by all practicable help, I think will be interesting to see how that develops over time. So we have an ongoing process of implementation. Some aspects of the Act have already been commenced, but the really crucial bit from this perspective, which will replace the sort of mental health law, has yet to be implemented, but that's planned for next year. We'll see. Our government isn't currently functioning very well, so that may, hopefully not, but that may slow things. So in terms of what types of support are needed, as I mentioned, in terms of the range of arguments for these approaches, there are some rights-based arguments which I've mentioned, but there are also some more pragmatic arguments which are based on the effectiveness of these approaches. They suggest that a wide range of supports are needed to meet the variety and complexity of people's needs. So these approaches, and Piers mentioned some of them as well, can go from simply providing accessible information to help with communication, person-centered planning processes, engaging with support networks and like family group conferencing and so on, advanced care planning and advocacy. Chartres and Braley suggest that the benefits of focusing on these approaches include promoting personal autonomy, independence and rights, providing a clear structure for support and decision-making, and ensuring a more comprehensive approach to support. A more recent systematic review of support decision-making for people with mental health problems reported a wider range of approaches, including representation agreements in Canada, which would be an example of the more formal approaches to support decision-making, the Personal Ombudsman Scheme in Sweden, the Open Dialogue model it was developed in Finland, Satira project in the States, advanced care planning, which we'll be hearing more about tomorrow, which would be great, peer advocacy and support. The Office of the Public Advocate in South Australia has done some great work in this area, and back in Kirchner were some of the really sort of early proponents of this approach. There's also a specific assess, simplify, know, maximize, and enable model, which was developed by Sai and her colleagues in Sydney, I think. So one way to think about the range of supports that are needed is to also consider them in the context of the different components of the functional test of capacity, which under most laws has the same sort of basic components of the person needs to understand the relevant information, be able to retain it for as long as they need to use it, be able to use, weigh, and appreciate, which I think perhaps is one of the more difficult aspects of this process to try and facilitate, especially when you get into thinking about things like probability and potential outcomes and so on. And the person also needs to be able to communicate their decision. In terms of what service users and family members and practitioners think about this, there's a really helpful study, which again Ellen was involved in Australia, which reported that there's a general acceptance across those different perspectives that support decision-making should be facilitated through legal schemes, including advanced statements and nominated persons, and through good practice models. He also identified a number of barriers, including an approach to care which was impersonal, stigma and discrimination, and emphasis on risk rather than recovery, and a lack of leadership in implementing support decision-making. The study I was involved in Northern Ireland, which also explored service users' experience, found some positive experiences of support, but also negative experiences of being excluded from decision-making processes, and very little awareness of any really of these more formal approaches that I've mentioned. So we have a lot of work to do really in terms of both providing these possible alternatives, but also ensuring that people are aware of them and can access them. An aspect of that study which surprised me, maybe shouldn't have surprised me, but there were a number of the people we interviewed mentioned that time was a really important factor, that often they felt under pressure from practitioners and services to make decisions, including major life decisions like where they were going to live and so on. So it's a further consideration. Just to mention another example from the Republic of Ireland, which developed its capacity law in parallel, and I think is going to implement theirs fully before us, but we'll see. They've introduced, or in the process of introducing, a much more structured framework for support, which has a number of formal rules. So at different levels, depending on the level of support that's needed. So people can appoint themselves a decision-making assistant. They can also appoint a co-decision maker who will be able to make decisions jointly with the person, and the courts can also appoint a decision-making representative. Within their act, there's also an emphasis on advanced planning and a decision support service, which is already operating. Yeah, if you're interested, their website's very helpful in terms of explaining the new legal framework there. So it'll be really interesting to see how that develops there as well, and about how well used these new rules are. In terms of the more recent research evidence, I guess these approaches overlap with initiatives that are more focused on preventing and reducing the need for coercion. Just a few examples. There was a randomized control trial in France recently looking at the effect of psychiatric advance directives facilitated by peer workers, specifically. So the effects on compulsory admission and mental health outcomes, which did find that they were effective in decreasing the need for compulsory admission, and some contributed to some improvement in mental health outcomes. The reducing coercion in Norway intervention was again a co-produced approach, but this time for primary mental health care to prevent compulsory admissions, which both focused on involvement of people and their families, but also on the wider approach of services, which is currently being tested, and again in an RCT. It's a project which is about to get underway, partnership with the National University of Ireland in Galway, which I'm involved in, which is to develop and evaluate an educational support. This is really focused on after people have been admitted involuntarily to hospital, in this case due to psychosis. And that project, I think, is helpful just to reinforce the idea that support decision-making is largely focused on trying to facilitate people to make their own decisions. But even with that support, if the person is unable to make the decision, those efforts should continue. Even if compulsory intervention is used, we obviously need to continue to involve the person and facilitate them to be as involved as they can be in the important decisions about their care and about their lives. In terms of the guidance available, as Piers mentioned, the World Health Organization guidance both on legal capacity and also on support decision-making is available. Jill Stavert, who's at Edinburgh Napier University, has done an awful lot of work in this area and produced really helpful guidance, good practice guidance on support decision-making for Scotland, but it applies more generally, I think. The project I mentioned earlier that Helen was involved in, one of the outputs of that project was guidelines for support decision-making and mental health services, which is also available online. And there's also a really great online course, is the Latrobe Support for Decision-Making Practice Framework Learning Resource. It was more developed with people with intellectual disabilities in mind, but it nonetheless is still a really helpful resource for thinking about mental health services too. Okay, so just finally, it's to think about how support decision-making might develop in the future. There are ongoing debates about language, especially in relation to Article 12 of the UNCRPD. That seems to centre around can or should really the definition of supported decision-making extend to when someone else is making the decision. I think it's probably helpful to retain that clear distinction, just to ensure that there are additional safeguards in place if it is someone else making the decision, but that is an ongoing debate. Within that, I think, as I mentioned earlier, it's important to distinguish between support for legal capacity, which may involve, I think, others making a decision, and supported decision making. There are lots of interesting potential uses of technology to support decision making. In Queen's, my sort of neighbour has a variety of virtual reality projects going on, which are mainly with a therapeutic focus, but they're also interested in how this may facilitate people to make decisions as well. So the evidence base is rapidly developing, but there still is a need to further explore the full range of what works for whom and in what circumstances. There may also be interesting possible further legal reform. It may be necessary to require support is provided by law. Arguably it isn't. I mean, arguably this is a good practice. Whether that happens without it being required by law is difficult to say. I think it's reasonable, though, to argue that having it in the law is not enough. There still needs to be a whole range of consideration about how we organise services and resource services to do that. So there's an ongoing general need for increased awareness, education and training. Okay, that's me. Thanks very much.